Good morning. In the 55 years since his passing, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has become legendary. When someone has a holiday named after them, we forget the struggle that their life was. Tomorrow, when you turn on the news, you will hear a speech from 1963, 5 years before he was assassinated. And they will gloss over the fact that the last year of his life was particularly difficult. I'm going to review his words and actions and people's reactions to him. Because whenever we meet resistance for our small efforts, we should realize that even the greatest activists struggle. On April 4, 1967, exactly 1 year before he died, he spoke at Riverside Church in New York City and denounced U.S. participation in Vietnam. He said, "Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and a brother of the suffering poor in Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak of the poor of America who are paying double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of people normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. We can no longer afford to worship a God of hate or bow before the altar of retaliation. The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever-rising tides of hate, and history is cluttered with the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursued the self-defeating path of hate. We have a choice today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace in Vietnam and justice throughout the developing world. The reaction to his speech was not positive. According to the Martin Luther King Research and Education Institute at Stanford, the immediate response to King's speech was largely negative. Both the Washington Post and the New York Times published editorials criticizing the speech, with the Post noting that King's speech had diminished his usefulness to his cause, to his country, and to his people through a simplistic and flawed view of the situation. Similarly, both the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People and Ralph Bunche accused King of linking two disparate issues, Vietnam and civil rights. Despite the public criticism, King continued to attack the Vietnam on both moral and economic grounds. In response to this criticism, he doubled down in his opposition to Vietnam. April 30th, at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, he told his home congregation, "Don't let anybody make you think God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman for the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with justice, and it seems I can hear God saying to America, 'You are too arrogant, and if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power, and I will place it in the hands of a nation that doesn't even know my name. Be still and know that I am God. Men will beat their swords into plow shafts and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not rise up against nation, neither shall they study war anymore.' I don't know about you, but I ain't going to study war no more." In August of 1967, he spoke to the Southern Christian Leadership Council. Power, properly understood, is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. Now, a lot of us are preachers, and all of us have a moral conviction and concerns, and so often have problems with power. There's nothing wrong with power if used correctly. You see, what happened to us is that some of our philosophers got off base. And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with the resignation of power and power with the denial of love. It was a misinterpretation that caused Nietzsche, who was a philosopher of the will to power, to reject the Christian concept of love. And it was the same misinterpretation which induced Christian theologians to reject Nietzschean philosophy of the will to power in the name of the Christian idea of love. Now we got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power, correcting anything that stands against love. I must confess, my friends, that the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will be still rocky places of frustration and meandering points of bewilderment. There will be inevitable setbacks here and there. There will be those moments when buoyancy of hope will be transformed into the fatigue of despair. Our dreams will sometimes be shattered and our ethereal hopes blasted. When our days become dreary with low hovering clouds of despair, and when our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, let us remember that there is a creative force in the universe, working to pull down gigantic mountains of evil, a power that is able to make a way out of no way and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Let us realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. King still believed in the power of nonviolence. But younger activists were advocating riots and self-defense. Stokely Carmichael, after King's death, said, "Dr. King's policy was, if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and will be moved to change his heart." That's very good. He only made one fallacious assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none. Now, I wouldn't say that about the United States as a whole, but it seems that in recent years there's been a rise of people who have no shame and say that if you call them racist, that you're being racist for pointing it out. King and the Southern Leadership Council were organizing a Poor People's March on Washington. He wanted to address the injustices of the capitalist system. It also lost him some allies because the government was always investigating him, saying that he was a communist. But he had as much disrespect for communism and that totalitarian state as he did for the capitalism that was cruel. He was seeking a middle way where people cared for each other and used the levers of government and power to help people rather than to dominate them. People wanted him to stay in his lane, said, "You're a civil rights activist. Don't talk about poverty. Don't talk about war." but he saw war and poverty and civil rights as connected. He was trying to be intersectional before we even had that word. He saw that all these oppressions were intertwined, but others did not share his vision. You know, there's times that to be a leader, you need to be 2 steps ahead of your followers. If you get 5 steps ahead of your followers, they start to reject you. If you challenge them to do more, it can be perceived as too much. And that was the position he was in the last year of his life. In August at Mount Pisgah Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago, he expressed this disappointment. He said, "I don't mind telling you this morning that sometimes I feel discouraged. I felt discouraged in Chicago. As I moved through Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama, I feel discouraged. Living every day under the threat of death, I feel discouraged sometimes. Living every day under extensive criticism, even from Negroes, I feel discouraged sometimes. Yes, sometimes I feel discouraged and I feel my works in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again." He had a vision, he had a faith that kept him going, even in this period of seeing no results. Even in this period when he knew that there was a good chance that he could be killed at any time. He elaborated on this theme in February 1968 in a sermon called "The Drum Major Instinct." Every now and then, I guess we all think realistically about the day when we will be victimized by what is life's final common denominator. That's something we call death. We all think about it, and every now and then I think about my own death, and I think about my own funeral. And I don't think of it in a morbid sense. Every now and then I ask myself, what is it that I would want said? And I leave the word with you this morning. If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get someone to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. Every now and then I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention I have a Nobel Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell him not to mention where I went to school. I'd like someone to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for someone to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice, that I was a drum major for peace, that I was a drum major for righteousness. And all the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. But I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I want to say. And I hope that's all that each of us would want to say. I just want to leave a committed life behind. Early in April 1968, King went to Memphis to support the striking sanitation workers. Fellow members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, wanted him to focus on the Poor People's March because it was only a month away. And all those last minute details when you're having a major march happening, there's just too much to do. But King insisted that these workers striking for better wages, a labor cause. It wasn't the war, it wasn't civil rights, it was good old-fashioned labor protesting. And he said that's where we need to be, because that's what this march is about. He said to a crowd gathered in Memphis, "It's all right to talk about the long white robes over yonder in all its symbolism, but ultimately people want some suits and dresses and shoes to wear down here. It's all right to talk about streets flowing with milk and honey, but God has commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here and his children who can't eat 3 square meals a day. It's all right to talk about the New Jerusalem, but one day God's preacher must talk about the new New York, the new Atlanta, the new Philadelphia, the new Los Angeles, and the new Memphis, Tennessee. That is what we have to do. Let us rise tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination. And let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be. We have the opportunity to make America a better nation." The speech was given the night before he was assassinated. He was fully aware that his time could be cut short. He concluded his speech with these words, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We have some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like any man, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." The next day, he was preparing for a rally, another fundraiser for these striking workers. And the last words that he is reported to have said was to the musician who was going to be playing that night. And he said, "Play, precious Lord. Play it real pretty." Went out to the balcony and was shot. He died at the age of 39, having done more than most of us will do in 99 years. His son, Martin Luther King III, is currently 65, the age of retirement. And his father, Martin Luther King Sr., lived to the age of 84 years and 11 months. Both have had distinguished careers, but less distinguished than Martin Luther King Jr. All of us, any of us, what we can hope to do is to meet the needs of our time. Our success or failure will be judged by others, but our worth is not determined by popular opinion. In the last year of his life, popular opinion had turned against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I met his father in 1981. Martin Luther King Sr. preached at Alma College in Michigan, where I was attending. It was the 80s. He was also in his 80s. At the reception the night before the service, I remember him being weary. He was tired from his flight. But his life had also been hard. In addition to his son being assassinated, his wife was murdered in 1974 at Ebenezer Baptist Church. She was playing the church organ. The murderer had come to church intending to kill him, but he was away that Sunday. So his wife got killed instead. Imagine living with that grief. But he continued on in his grief. And it came to pass that he was called to preach to a group of privileged kids at a private Presbyterian college in central Michigan. The chaplain talked to him the day before the service and said, "What scripture are you going to preach on?" And coming from the gospel tradition, Dr. King, or Mr. King Sr. said, "Oh, I'll just open the Bible and preach." But being a good Presbyterian, the chaplain said, "Well, we'd like to put something in the order of service." And he said, "Well, you pick something. You're a preacher too." And the chaplain didn't really feel like choosing the topic for him. He said, "No, I'd really rather you choose." And he says, "Well, that passage where Jesus says, 'Feed my sheep.' You know that one." And he says, "Yes." And he hangs up the phone. And then he calls the chapel council and says, "We need to find the scripture where Jesus says, 'Feed the sheep.'" I was too embarrassed to tell him that I couldn't recall that right off the top of my head. And so all of us were looking through our Bibles, and I was the lucky one who found it. It's in John 21. It's after Jesus is resurrected and he's fishing with his old buddies, and he talks to Peter. Peter, who had denied him 3 times, famously, while he was facing resurrection, or facing crucifixion. But after the resurrection, Jesus came and gave Peter another chance and asked, "Do you love me?" And Peter said, "Yes." He says, "Feed my lambs." Then Jesus asked again, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "You know I love you." "Yes." He said, "Shepherd my sheep." And then Jesus asked the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He says, "Yes." He says, "Feed my sheep." Now, whenever I've said I love you to someone, I never hope for them to give me a job afterwards. Shepherd my sheep, feed my sheep. But what Jesus, or the writer of the Gospel of John, was trying to convey is that love is not a sentimental thing. It's something we do. It's something we do to feed the needs of the people. And that is what each of us must do. That is the Jesus that Martin Luther King Sr. believed and Martin Luther King Jr. believed in. The Jesus who was love in action. And that is what we need to think about this day and all days to the rest of our lives. How will we put our love into action. How will we leave the world a better place after we're gone? May we bless and be blessed.